it would be certainly a crisis for NATO if Greece left it. I don't know what the implications would be. But I think the other countries would just have to accept it and rebuild their defenses around it, the new situation.
Professor, you said, and I agree, that euro is a unique, sounds unique, a one-way experiment. But on the other hand, you said that only political risks or a war could jeopardize it. But we see today that the euro creates a lot of political tension. We have a very big tension here in Greece, in other countries, and we have a split between the north and the south. And how do you think this could be overcome? And the second aspect of this question is, suppose the ECB becomes something like the Federal Reserve, and we have some kind of union, and the euro continues to exist. What will be the position of Greece, and not even Greece, of Italy? Italy lost euro, amplified the differences of competitiveness. So, will this thing continue? Will Italy continue to lose ground on the competition with Germany and the other countries? And how could this be resolved?
It's nothing very unusual. It's between debtors and creditors. That's the main issue, and the creditors, in this case, let's say Germany and maybe France, want to see that they're going to, there's going to be a product of the loans, of the bailouts that are being made. And they have, in the past, had a bad experience with Greece in reporting things and et cetera, et cetera. All countries fudge data and do that, but Greece did it in a very big way. And so that was a big issue. And so I think that it's not unusual for the creditors to be, to want to make sure, because what you have in Europe is you've got to have adjustment on the part of the deficit countries. You need to have bailouts, and these have to be done together, but the bailouts can't be so quick that they inhibit adjustment. And so there's this cat and mouse game that is played out in it. And then the third part of it that has to be done and pushed forward is the political integration, the big steps in that direction. As Miranda was mentioning, the banking union, that's one approach there. But another more important thing that was, let's say, a European Ministry of Finance. Trichet proposed this in his speech in Aachen on June the 2nd, 2011, about a year or so ago. He proposed a European Ministry of Finance with powers. But the question is, what would that European Ministry of Finance do? If he had the same power as the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States, would that be enough? Well, it wouldn't be enough, because the Secretary of Treasury in the United States has a lot of power over 23% of GDP, US GDP in spending, the central government GDP. But the central government in Europe is only 2% or 3% of GDP. So a Secretary of Treasury like the United States wouldn't do any good at all in Europe. It would have to be one that either you transferred functions to make the central government more important, and then you'd have power like the United States, or it would mean something different, that this would be a minister, not a minister of finance in the usual sense, but someone who's going to be going to coordinate policies of the existing countries without doing something. And I think this is what has to be done. But we don't have any models of that. I think there's no model in history of that that kind of Ministry of Finance in existence. So it has to be thought through again, just how you would work that problem out.
Tasso.
Thanks. Professor Mundell, I am wondering whether an effort to transform the African continent with a population of over 1 billion into a region of growth through intensive capital investments, giving wealth and strong domestic demand could help developed countries to restore production capacity, utilization, and help the global growth by increasing exports to that continent. Thank you.
The question was if Europe would support Africa, so Africa would grow faster, then demand from African countries for European products would also be into a virtuous cyclical motion.
Yes, well, it would be certainly a good project down the line to do, but it wouldn't be a solution to Europe's problems. It would be a project over the long run that would contribute to the buildup of both Africa and Europe. But it wouldn't be. It would be a drain on Europe at the present time.
Δεν είναι αμέσου αποτελεσματικότητας, αλλά σίγουρα είναι από τα πράγματα τα οποία πρέπει να γίνουν. 3 ερωτήσεις έχουμε ακόμη και τελειώσαμε για το reception.
Κύριε Πέτρο, θα ήθελα να μεταφράσει την ερώτησή μου για να είμαι σαφής. Ακούσαμε αυτό που όλοι ξέρουμε, ότι πράγματι δεν μπορεί κανείς να μας υποχρεώσει να βγούμε από το ευρώ. Ακόμα και αν είμαστε σε default. Αυτό το ξέρουμε. Εκείνο για το θέμα στο οποίο υπάρχει μεγάλη σύγχυση στην ελληνική κοινωνία είναι το εξής. Πώς η Ελλάδα θα ικανοποιήσει τις ανάγκες της under default μέσα στο ευρώ. Τι θα κάνουμε από εκεί και πέρα.
The question is, even if the other European countries cannot force us out of the euro, how can Greece survive under conditions of default on its foreign debt within Europe, within the European structure?
Well, if you default, and assuming there are no reprisals, just go on with what you're doing.
Would be how would salaries be paid? How would pensioners be paid? This kind of thing. How would the budget be met?
When you default, if you're defaulting on bonds and defaulting on commitments to wage earners and to pensioners and people like that are in the same category. You have to then decide which of these are you going to protect. But this is a kind of triage that we're talking about, battlefield triage, not serious policy.
Θέλει πολύ προγραμματισμό κάτι τέτοιο και δεν είναι κάτι το οποίο θα πρότεινε. Μετά θα πρέπει να έχεις προτεραιότητες, ποιος πληρώνεται πρώτα, γιατί θα είναι μια πάρα πολύ σύνθετη κατάσταση.
So, Professor, is Eurobond a solution? Can we move to a Eurobond solution? Does debt settlement a solution between the nations? The Eurobond, if we move on to Eurobond, is a solution for Eurobond?
I think it is. It is a very big ace in the hole for Europe, and for reasons that haven't been made really clear yet. Several years ago, I was pushing strongly the argument that Europe, this is before the crisis, Europe should create a euro bond, because, a euro bill, a bill particularly, because the dominant bill internationally and the world today is the U.S. Treasury bill, 3-month Treasury bill. It really plays a role similar in some ways to what the sterling bill did in the 19th century for Britain. And it's very dominant. And so because of that, you have, let's say, well, adding to it both bonds and bills outstanding, you have like $6 to $7 trillion of outstanding holdings of these bills outside the United States. But Europe could get a good chunk of that, a good piece of that, because there are a lot of people who think that the long-run role of the dollar is going to be down against other currencies, maybe in Asia, and even against the euro. So there's people would like to shift into a more of a balanced position between the dollar and the euro, but there's no euro bill there, and there's no euro bond. Nobody wants to buy, heavens, Portuguese bonds or Greek bonds or Greek bills or anything like that. They wouldn't touch those. But even German bills get down to low interest rates and not worth getting. So Germany's not big enough. So if you could create this, you'd have access to a source of capital in the short run that would be $1, $2, $3 trillion over the next 5 years, I think. And it would be a tremendous asset in helping to solve the problem of these. Now, the big problem is that how do you introduce these euro bonds, and do you start off with, if you're doing it today, would you put Greek bonds in those, or would you take away Greek bonds and maybe Italian and maybe in Spanish bonds and Portuguese bonds? Would you create a euro bond that has all the countries, or would you leave out some of the countries in it? That's the big political issue and the big problem. But the opportunity is there. So there's a pot of gold at the other side of the rainbow, and it is the euro bonds and euro bills which would solve the problem. But nobody in Europe should want to use this as a tool to solve the problem if you're not making adjustments and you're not going to go back to profligate government spending that is going to bankrupt all Europe if it continues.
Thank you.
Είπε ότι πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα η ερώτηση. Πρώτη προτεραιότητα είναι να συμμαζευτούν τα δημόσια οικονομικά και να σταματήσουν οι αλόγιστες δαπάνες, τις οποίες δεν μπορούν τα κράτη να χρηματοδοτήσουν. Αυτό που δεν μπορεί να χρηματοδοτήσεις δεν μπορεί να το ξοδεύεις και πρέπει να κατανοηθεί αυτό. Και από εκεί και πέρα θεωρεί ότι είναι εξαιρετική ιδέα να προχωρήσει όχι απλώς στην έκδοση ευρωομολόγων, αλλά ευρωεντόκων γραμματείων, όπως η αμερικανική αγορά Treasury Bill έχει γίνει πλέον τεράστια και αποκομίζουν πολλά ωφέλη οι Αμερικάνοι από τη διεθνή ζήτηση, όχι την εσωτερική ζήτηση για τέτοια γραμμάτια. Το ίδιο όφελος θα είχε και η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση από τέτοια διεθνή ζήτηση για τα ευρωπαϊκά γραμμάτια, και από εκεί και πέρα θα έπρεπε να δει κανείς ποια είναι η συμμετοχή κάθε κράτους σε αυτό το γενικό πουλ αυτών των γραμματείων. Αλλά καταρχήν είναι κάτι που πρέπει να εξεταστεί, αλλά πολύ παράλληλα και με τη δημοσιονομική σταθερότητα.
Θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω, Γιώργος Λιάνης, δικηγόρος, ήθελα να ρωτήσω. Η καταγγελία του μνημονίου, η καταγγελία της Δανειακής Σύμβασης είναι η μοναδική λύση για την Ελλάδα, είναι η πιο υποφελής λύση για την Ελλάδα, όπως λένε διαπρεπείς και σοβαροί Έλληνες οικονομολόγοι, ή ενέχει κινδύνους αυτή η λύση, ή είναι η τελευταία λύση αφού αποτύχουν όλες οι προσπάθειες, ή δεν είναι καν λύση αυτό?
The question is there a possibility, or would it be worthwhile to consider Greece unilaterally abandoning the so-called memorandum with the Troika and going its own way because the memorandum imposes a lot of hardships to the Greek people. Would that be a viable solution, going away from what Greek Parliament has signed as obligations for reform?
I think it would be very bad tactics.
A last question, unless there's something very, very important that somebody else would like to ask. Konstantinos Lambrinopoulos, that's the last question, yeah.
Mr. Professor, how the euro can survive in Europe if we don't have common economical ministry? Every country is doing whatever they like. For instance, if you remember, the subprime real estate problem started in 2008 in the United States, 7, and the crisis, the toxic crisis, came to Europe quickly afterwards. I remember 2008, Barroso was here discussing with the previous Karamanlis Prime Minister, was saying that we are doing perfectly well, we don't have any problem with this. And the next day we wake up with a debt close to 1 trillion. How this situation occurred, can we avoid that in the not too distant future, please?
Well, there were a lot of things that were quite strange when the euro was created. 1999, and at that time, just before it, or a little bit before it, the interest rates on all the southern countries, the poor countries, was very high. Some cases it went up over 10%. And then very quickly, once the euro came into being after January 1, 1999, then interest rates converged, and they converged at a very low level, not, very close to the German level. And everybody believed that those debts in euros were now default-free assets. And when Greece came in, there were a lot of questions because Greece it was a much poorer country than the others, and what would happen. But Greece interest rates also went down as if they were default-free assets. It's really strange why for several years interest rates were very low. Now, what people have used this as an argument that it's those interest rates, low interest rates suddenly, that encouraged governments to spend a great deal more because the debt could be sold at such a high price, low interest rates and so on. But what people didn't realize, or they didn't articulate or follow the implications of, is that these interest rates were not low in real terms. They were low in nominal terms, but they were now real interest rates they were paying. When countries like Italy had a interest rate of 13%, 12%, something like that, that was taking into account an inflation premium and a devaluation plus inflation premium. And then when they came into the Eurozone, these came down, but these were now low. If anyone thought those were nominal interest rates that could be devalued away, it was just a complete mistake, because these were now real interest rates, and people didn't make that distinction. These are now real euros. It's like debts that were in the old days in gold rather than in paper money.
Θα την κάνω την ερώτηση στα ελληνικά, για τη μεταφράσετε. Υψηλά Τιτζούρο, Σύμβουλος Επιχειρήσεων. Ήθελα να ρωτήσω, ακούμε για συμφωνίες μεταξύ, όπως και υπήρξαν και δημοσιεύματα αντίστοιχα, του Ιράν με τη Ρωσία και την Κίνα για αγορά πετρελαίου σε τοπικά νομίσματα, δηλαδή σε γιουάν και σε ρούβλια. Αν θεωρεί ότι επηρεάζει την κατάσταση η μεταβολή των αποθεματικών, όπως επίσης αν θεωρεί ότι στο μέλλον θα επηρεάσουν και τη μεταβολή στις δυνάμεις των παραγωγικών συντελεστών. Αυτό.
The question is that it appears that Iran is making agreements with Russia, China, and others to sell oil at local currency denominations rather than dollar or the euro. What are the medium and long-term effects of such a thing? Would it jeopardize the role of the reserve currencies if people start denominating oil transactions in other currencies other than the dollar or the euro?
Well, countries were always free to do that anyway. There's no rule that says they have to be priced in dollars. It's just tradition. And of course, it's very much people were following the practice of Saudi Arabia, which is an ally of the United States. So that's a very close connection there. And of course, Iran has, in the past, wanted to team up with pals in Venezuela to try to form an alternative to the dollar as a currency. I don't think, now China's role in this is a little different, and because China is very ambitious to make the RMB into a major currency. It's a little, you would like to see, have some of the power of the dollar that the U.S. gets from it. And I've said that they always keep asking me. I go to China every other month, and they ask me what are the conditions for this. And I said the two conditions of becoming a reserve currency is that you run deficits. First is you have to run deficits. You have to run deficits because you have to make it available. And then, so you, now, and then of course, then other countries want to hold it. They want to hold your assets. Now, China could become, I could imagine certainly in 30 years or 40 years, a major currency in the world. Currencies, over time, they fluctuate. The dominant currency historically, you go back to the Persian daric and the drachma, the stater, and the Macedonian stater, and the Roman aureus, and so on, all the way up through the dominant currencies in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. And then you come to the French, and then the British period, and then the American period. So it's a question of how long will the dollar era really end? I gave a speech in Hong Kong in about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to the Asian Society. And someone asked me, when will the RMB take over from the dollar as the world currency? And I answered, I don't know the answer to that, but I can phrase it another way. How long will the dollar era last? And I said, my answer would be, I don't know. I can't, it's arbitrary what I would say, but I would say 100 years. And then he was very, very surprised at that. And then 6 years later, I gave another speech to the same society, and a person there who had heard my question asked me, how long will the dollar era last? And I said, 94 years. But currency areas hang on for a long time. The pound sterling was a reserve currency into the 1950s, long after Britain had lost its dominance. And it takes a while for a country to develop. So I don't know. The point is that it's not just the size of the GDP that's important in transactions area. But the other thing that's important is the sophistication in finance. And it's no accident that the dominant currency of the late 19th century was Britain, which had the most sophisticated financial system in the world, and that in the 20th century, the United States, which in some respects, at least until recently maybe, had the most sophisticated currency system.
Βασικά, τα κυρίαρχα νομίσματα κρατάνε πολύ. Η κίνηση που έκανε το Ιράν να πουλάει σε Ρωσίες, Κίνες, στα τοπικά τους νομίσματα, δεν είναι από μόνη της πολύ μεγάλης σημασίας, γιατί το να πουλάνε σε δολάρια ήταν μια σύμβαση βασικά με τη Σαουδική Αραβία, η οποία διευκόλυνε και τους άλλους. Λόγω της διευκόλυνσης αυτής, το εμπόριο στο πετρέλαιο γίνεται σε δολάρια. Αυτό το οποίο έχει όμως σημασία είναι ότι η Κίνα αναπτύσσεται με πάρα πολύ γρήγορους ρυθμούς και δεύτερον είναι εξαιρετικά φιλόδοξο κράτος. Και κάθε φορά που πηγαίνει στο Πεκίνο και στη Σαγκάη, το ρωτάνε σε πόσο καιρό θα γίνει το κινέζικο ρεμίμμπι αυτό ένα reserve currency, αποθεματικό νόμισμα. Η απάντησή του είναι ότι ποτέ δεν ξέρεις ούτε πόσο θα διαρκέσει η κυριαρχία του δολαρίου σαν μέσο διεθνών συναλλαγών, ούτε πόσο γρήγορα θα ανέβει το ρεμίμμπι, αλλά ένας πρόχειρος υπολογισμός θα ήταν καμιά 30 χρόνια, υπό την προϋπόθεση ότι θα είχαν ελλείμματα και ανοίγματα στην Κίνα, ώστε το ρεμίμμπι να είναι διαθέσιμο στους ξένους, ώστε να το κρατάνε σαν απόθεμα και να επενδύουν σε αυτό. Αλλά βασικά είναι πολύ νωρίς για να πει κανείς ότι η περίοδος του δολαρίου ή και του ευρώ έχει παρέλθει. Όπως είναι η ιστορία με τη στερλίνα, τα άλλα dominant νομίσματα της αρχαιότητας, ο μακεδονικός στατήρας, η δραχμή κλπ. Κρατούσαν όλα αυτά για μια εξαιρετικά μεγάλη περίοδο. The question is that the common folk in Europe are taking the blunt of and the major brunt of the suffering. What is it that they can do to alleviate such suffering, given the behavior of the political elites?
I don't know who's suffered most proportionately, and I don't know what was the haircut on the last debt? Was it 20%?
80%.
80%.
Effectively 80%.
80%. Do you say the common folk lost more than those people?
Μία απάντηση είναι ότι η χασούρα είναι γενικευμένη. Ακόμη και αυτοί που δάνεισαν τα χρήματά τους στη χώρα μας έχασαν 80% και δεν έχει βγει κανείς κερδισμένος από αυτή την κρίση και η συνταγή την οποία είχε πει ότι πρέπει να υπάρχει μια υπευθυνότητα στη διαχείριση των δημόσιων οικονομικών. Όσο δεν υπάρχει αυτή η υπευθυνότητα και η σχέση μεταξύ εσόδων του κράτους και εξόδων του κράτους να είναι ισορροπημένη, πάντα θα έχουμε αυτά τα προβλήματα τα οποία βλέπουμε. Κωνσταντίνε.
Well, Professor, you said in the beginning that you believe that the parity between the dollar and the euro has to be 1-to-1. This is what you believe, or this is what it has to be. And you also said that China is a country that maybe it will create difficulties for the other currencies in the future. We also saw that there is a virtual currency between China and Japan for their bilateral agreements. This is what we have read in the newspapers. So the question is, how far you believe is a common currency or a virtual common currency between the euro and the dollar in the years to come in order to overcome the Chinese development or the Chinese threat?
Πολύ σύντομα το ερώτημα είναι αν οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες και η Ευρώπη θα μπορούσαν να δημιουργήσουν μεταξύ τους πλέον ένα κοινό νόμισμα. Whether the US and Europe themselves could form a currency union or a common currency.
Or a virtual common currency.
Either a virtual or a real common currency between the dollar and the euro.
Well, I've been proposing for the past 3 or 4 years a dollar and a euro stabilization. And at that time, it would have been when the euro was around 145 or something like that. I thought it would be good to stabilize at $1.30 as the range, but you could, and the different ways you could do the stabilization. I don't need to go into technical ways of doing it. There are different techniques. But that, if the United States and Europe, Federal Reserve and European Central Bank could coordinate monetary policy, then I think this would be a wonderful thing, because I do think that a lot of the problems in the last 20 years, financial world, has been to the big instability of the dollar-euro exchange rate, because you have a coordinated collective money market, but it's very confusing with the dollar-euro picture and the big swings in these. It's always, just imagine New York. If you were in New York and the New York Stock Exchange, and you suddenly decide you're going to use 2 currencies in New York instead of one. And so I think that's a good way. And I've gone further than this to say, now, if you combine the dollar and the euro together, this represents an area of 40%, nearly 40% of the world economy. But I've said, let's think of the future with the rise of China. China has right now the euro area, the dollar has 15 trillion GDP, let's say, and the euro area 14 trillion, something like that. China's coming along with 8-9 trillion coming up like that, but soon it'll have 12, it'll be comparable. So China's always wanted to fix to the dollar anyway, and the Americans have always been pushing them to appreciate against the dollar. But add China to it and have this 3 currency by fixing 2 exchange rates, the dollar-euro and the dollar-RMB exchange rate. You get 50% of the world economy, all by fixing 2 exchange rates, and you have the basis for a global monetary system back in place. It would, I think, be a tremendous improvement over this one. And of course, you would have to get agreement with China to coordinate monetary policy, not to run a perpetual balance of payment surplus that they're doing at the present time. But you have to coordinate the monetary policy. But I think that would be a tremendous improvement. Now, the big obstacle to it up until now, I don't think it's ever been the European Central Bank. I think the European Central Bank would be, under certain conditions, amenable to this. But the big obstacle to it is the United States. And the fact right now, well, they would make the argument right now, oh, euro is in a big problem now. We don't want to tie ourselves to that. That would be it. But beneath it is the fact that Americans have got into this idea that they want to be independent and they don't want to tie their hands in the future. But that could change, because as their share of the world economy declines as the world currency, as the euro rises, as China rises, they'll lose traction, and it'll be very much in their interest to do this.
Η απάντηση είναι ότι βεβαίως θα βλέπε αυτή την σχέση ευρώ-δολαρίου να σταθεροποιείται. Θα ήταν εξαιρετικά ευεργετική για την παγκόσμια οικονομία και σε δεύτερη φάση ακόμη και με την Κίνα, με το ρεμπίνμπι. Αυτό σημαίνει ότι θα πρέπει να υπάρχει μεγαλύτερος συντονισμός νομισματικών πολιτικών, αλλά θα έχεις τρία κράτη, τρεις γεωγραφικές περιοχές, Αμερική, Ευρώπη, Κίνα, που ελέγχουν πάνω από το 50% της παγκόσμιας οικονομίας, να είναι μια λίμνη σταθερότητος. Βλέπει αντιδράσεις από τους Αμερικάνους, οι οποίοι θέλουν να έχουν πολύ περισσότερους βαθμούς ελευθερίας και ανεξαρτησίας, οι Αμερικάνοι, αλλά όσο περνάει ο καιρός και μειώνεται ο όγκος της Αμερικής σε σχέση με τον όγκο της παγκόσμιας οικονομίας, θεωρεί αυτό ότι θα μπορούσε να είναι εφικτό. Όχι άμεσα, αλλά πλησιάζει ο χρόνος, κυρίως όταν εξισορροπηθούν τα πράγματα στην Ευρώπη και δεν είναι σε περίοδο κρίση η Ευρώπη, και όταν είναι σε περίοδο κρίση δεν θέλει να την πλησιάσει κανείς. Κανείς δεν πλησιάζει κάτι που κάνει η GIS. Θα αρχίσει η κατάσταση αυτή να ομαλοποιείται και θα μπορέσουμε να προχωρήσουμε σε κάτι τέτοιο. Νομισματική σταθερότητα μεταξύ ευρώ και δολαρίου και αργότερα μεταξύ των δύο αυτών και της Κίνας. Professor,
I've called this the DEY plan, the DEY for dollar, euro, yuan plan. And I presented this in March 28th last year in Nanjing, China, but I had a very good audience of President Sarkozy, Strauss-Kahn, then head of the IMF, Trichet, Joe Shoshan, the head of the European Central Bank, and Geithner. And after this, Geithner came up to me and talked for about 5-10 minutes about how that would work and so on. So at least he knows about it. It's not to say that would be acceptable at all to the U.S., but at least they know something about it.
Όπως αντιληφθήκατε, ήδη το έχει βάλει μπροστά αυτό και είχε και μια μεγάλη συνάντηση με τον Υπουργό Οικονομικών, τον Geithner, στην Αμερική, με σκοπό να προχωρήσει αυτό το όραμα το οποίο έχει της πολύ στενότερης σύνδεσης των νομισμάτων αυτών. Θα πάρει λίγο καιρό, αλλά όπως προσέχετε, ήδη το έχει βάλει μπρος. Θέλω να σας ευχαριστήσω όλους πολύ θερμά για την παρουσία και τη συμμετοχή σας. Professor, it has been very, very enlightening for us. Thank you very much. God be with you. God bless you.
Γιάννη, το Γιαννάκι μας τον είδες. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.